Hi, my name is Tom Miller. I am a former director of the Educational Partnerships Program, which is now Community Programs at Perkins School for the Blind. And I was also education director of a collaborative program on the North Shore at the New England North Shore Education Consortium. I have about 40 years of experience in special education. And what I want to share with you is a perspective about what makes a successful team meeting in the development of an IEP. I feel that many times we get caught up in what I'll call positions, and that we go into IEP meetings ready for a battle, when we should really go into the IEP meeting with the sense of we're building a team and we're looking to find the optimal supports for our sons and daughters. Again, I want to emphasize you're not an individual on this team, but that your teacher of the visually impaired, your orientation mobility specialist, teacher of the deaf blind, all of these people should be working with you to help school districts understand the unique needs of your child. Our goals for today are to look at the family as core members of the IEP team. I know many times you go into an IEP and you feel like overwhelmed, that there are so many professionals sitting around the table and you're by yourself. In an effective IEP meeting, we'll be talking about this. There should be prior discussion. Not everything shouldn't happen at that IEP meeting, but it should be a collaborative process, and that's what we're going to stress today. First is the definition of collaboration. Collaboration is a joint effort of multiple individuals or work groups to accomplish a task or project. Well, we know that our students, or your sons and daughters, are fairly complex and often require the services of many providers to develop an effective program. You have the occupational therapist, the physical therapist, the speech and language pathologist, the teacher of students with visual impairments, the orientation mobility specialist. You have their classroom teacher, and in inclusive settings, you also have the general education teacher. And if they're deafblind, you may have a deafblind consultant. On top of this, we also have to look at the fact that that team is composed of the administrators, or the individuals who coordinate the programs for your sons and daughters, the principals in the school it might be, or it might be the special education director. And so when we look at this, what we're trying to do is get a group, a large group of people together to accomplish a common goal. And that common goal is the establishment of an effective program for your son or daughter. Then we look at the definition of advocacy. On this definition from the dictionary, it says the act of pleading for, supporting, or recommending. And then there's a phrase that I've highlighted, active espousal. I kind of like that better. IEP meetings shouldn't be pleading for supports, but we do need to advocate, and to advocate effectively, need to build common understanding and the sense that we're heading toward a common goal. The key thing in the quote that's below it is that advocacy is really building relationships with people. Our IEP meetings are a relationship meeting. They're meetings where we are trying to form an interdependent support group. The following video will give you a perspective on an ineffective meeting. It's a meeting where things aren't going quite right. And I want you to watch the video, and as you watch it, be thinking about what you see. What are the things that may be barriers to an effective IEP meeting?
Oh, you can do the boomer one. This is what we're doing.
Morning. Morning. Well, welcome back to our IEP meeting. I think before we get started, it would be good for everybody to introduce themselves. I'm Bruce Goldstein. I'm the Director of Special Education for the school district.
I'm Sue Griebler, the first grade teacher at Jones Elementary.
I'm Joe Frisetta. I'm Reed's dad.
I'm Gail Frisetta. I'm Reed's mom.
I'm Virginia Stern. I'm the speech language pathologist at Kennedy School.
Glad to have you here. I think we had a very good first meeting, and we're here now to deal with the issues that we left open from the last meeting. We're talking about placement for Reed and services.
Right.
Did you have an opportunity to get to the Kennedy School?
No, we really didn't. You know, that's a 20-minute ride from our house, and it's pretty far. And that's really not what we want for Reed anyway. We really think he belongs in a normal classroom. And so I really didn't see the need to go there.
It is unfortunate. The Kennedy School is a school that we're really proud of in the school district. We've designed it for children with hearing losses. Maybe we could have Mrs. Stern at least tell you a little bit about the program there.
I'd be glad to. The Kennedy School has 55 children with communication disorders, all sorts of communication disorders, including children who are deaf and hard of hearing. And we have developed a very fine program for those students at Kennedy School.
That's exactly the environment we don't want Reed in. We want him in a mainstream school. We don't want him in that type of environment.
Yeah, we just moved him out of a school where he was with 8 other deaf and hard of hearing kids in his classroom, and that was the problem. He wasn't getting socialization there. They had the same language delays that he did, and he didn't have any role models for language.
Well, at the Kennedy School, what we've got really is the best of all possible worlds. We were talking about Reed maybe in the morning or for half the day he would be in a regular classroom, and then in the afternoon he'd be in the separate room with Mrs. Stern, who's really going to be able to work intensively on some of these services. Our concern, I think, Reed has a language delay. What is that, Mrs. Stern?
I would say 18-month delay, yes, 18-month delay.
Well, with an 18-month delay, we're concerned about, Reed just going into the regular classroom for the whole day.
I think he needs a full-time aide in the classroom that's going to help him with socialization with the other children. And we also think that he needs 3 therapy sessions a week with a speech-language pathologist. That's what we want for him.
Well, let's try to parse this out and take it piece by piece. Mrs. Griebler, at Jones Elementary in the first grade, how large can that class be?
It's usually between 20 and 25 students. But I do not have a full-time aide in that classroom. I only have an aide for special activities.
I think that with a large class like that, coming from a small class setting in the private school, we're concerned that with the language delay, Reed might really struggle in that classroom.
The language delay that you're talking about, 18 months, isn't what we had him tested at. That's your own testing.
Well, we haven't seen any other testing that would show anything to the contrary, and we have to go with objective data based upon the appropriate tests. We are concerned providing an appropriate placement for Reed, and we want him to succeed and to do well. You're speaking about wanting him to be in a mainstream setting. Well, we give that in the morning at Kennedy, but then we can give him the intensive services to work on those.
Why are you trying to hold back this child?
We're actually trying to provide him with the supports that will...
No, Mr. Goldstein, you're not. We want him to have 3 therapy sessions a week with a speech-language pathologist, and that's going to help close the gap. And having a full-time aide in the classroom is really going to help him with his socialization skills. That's what we want, and that's what he really deserves.
Well, let's talk about those socialization skills. You're talking about having an aide, but that aide is going to be in between his interactions with the other children if we provide that at the Jones School. I mean, wouldn't that be your experience, Mrs. Griebler?
I would think so.
I mean, we want him to be able to interact with his peers, but at the Kennedy School, where we've had this program designed for children with hearing loss and specifically for deaf children, the teachers are used to having deaf children there. Have you had, and Mrs. Griebler, if you had any deaf children in your class?
It's such
He's
a
not
low
going to be really
incidence.
able to reach his full potential being in a Kennedy school.
What experience have you had, Mrs. Griebler, in terms of dealing with children who are deaf?
I have not had a deaf child in my class. It's a very low incidence handicap. And I've had some hard of hearing children in the past.
You're going to have more kids coming along that are fit that exact mold that Reed is in, and the mainstream schools are going to have to accommodate these kids. That's all there is to it. And Reed is going to be the starting point.
Well, what we have at Kennedy is actually a program that's designed to deal with this low incidence disability, where we've concentrated resources so that he can be in a regular mainstream setting and then also get the intensive services in the afternoon, and then we don't have to have this aid to deal with the socialization issues.
Right, and with 55 children with communication disorders at Kennedy School, we can plan much more efficiently to give each child the therapy he or she needs.
And you want to have somebody who's got experience with deaf children, whereas at the Jones School, we wouldn't be able to provide that service. We've designed a program that's intensively for students who are deaf and other communication.
But they're all children that are deaf and have other communication disorders. He needs to be in a classroom where he has language role models that he can model after.
Well, he will have that in the morning because that would be a regular classroom at Kennedy. So he'll get that opportunity. But then in addition,
They're not the goals we agreed upon here. We're not going over the same material here. This is different. So that's not what we agreed on.
We're not disagreeing on the goals. We're saying what's the best way to get to those goals. And, you know, we've got a lot of experience in the district working with children who are deaf. And this is what we think is really going to provide him the supports to enable him to succeed, as opposed to dropping him into a situation where he doesn't have the supports.
Mr. Goldstein, you don't understand. Reed deserves this opportunity to be in his neighborhood school. And I am very upset that you're not willing to even listen to or consider our wants and needs for our child. We know him best.
Well,
and
I like to think in pictures or to think in analogies. And this is an analogy of what you may have seen, and we'll discuss some of the things that you did see or possibly saw at the ineffective IEP meeting. I like this term dirty bricks. Dirty bricks are non-productive, and they're things that build walls between us. And I think many times we can engage in a lot of negative discussion at IEP meetings when we really should be focused on the positive and the strength of the student and the program we're trying to create. So what you may have seen in that video was that the parents started out by saying, no, they didn't go visit the school. They started out with a strong position that they wanted their son or daughter included, in this case, their son. And their body language and the body language of the team was not very inviting, all right? And everybody on both sides started sentences with the terms, I think, we want. And this is not the way to build a collaborative program. Because again, what happens and what you saw there are barriers, and people are placing their positions on the table without listening to one another. So the question can become, how can we make this team more effective? You see one person rowing the boat with everyone else giving commands. We want to be aware before we go into an IEP meeting of opinions and perceptions, those dirty bricks that we may have formed or that we think others may have formed about us. Each child and each family is unique, all right? And each team is really unique. And, you know, one of the things that we will confront and talk about later is that as teams change, we often need to rebuild our relationships as members of that team. We need to be careful not to prejudice team function by going in with preconceived impressions. We may have heard rumors that this OT or this PT or this administrator is not supportive of children with visual impairments because someone may have had a negative experience with them. But not knowing the context of that experience, we really need to go into the meeting with a belief that they are committed, because educators and administrators do go into special education, committed to providing services and appropriate services for students, whether they have visual impairments or other disabilities, that we go in with that mindset that this IEP meeting is focused on our child and that we can build an effective team. This, again, I think is something I'd like to share. I came across this years ago, and I've been using it in terms of how I approach IEP meetings. But there are golden rules of human behavior, or aspects of human behavior, which pretty much hold true. And I want you to think about and reflect on, you know, how these phrases might apply to you. So all behavior is designed by the person engaged in it to serve his or her own values. All right, we all have a value system. We all have our beliefs. In the case of special education, we may have people that believe strongly in inclusion. We may have people that believe strongly in specialized schools. We may have people that say that, you know, students with certain types of disabilities need direct service, others only need indirect. People have these values, and everyone comes into a meeting with a values system. And the goal of the IEP and the discussion that should occur in the IEP is to really look at how do we get our values to work together? How do we get this team to function and focus? You should never expect anyone to engage in a behavior that serves your values unless you give them adequate reason to do so. This is an important one. And I'll show you a little bit later how it applies specifically to students with visual impairments. But if we think about the changes in behavior that we've tried to make, maybe, I know I tried lots of times to go on diets, but, if we think about the changes that we've tried to make in our lives, they don't happen if it's just someone saying, you need to do this, you need to do that. It happens because we understand that we do maybe perhaps have a health condition. So all of a sudden we've diagnosed with diabetes, and we end up then realizing we do need to change our diet, we do need to exercise more. And so what that value we have now internalized, and now we have the reason that we're going to pursue the change. And this really applies to the fact that many times individuals on the IEP team have limited to no experience with a student with visual impairments, and or students with additional disabilities or deafblindness. And we need to always remember that, because to get someone to change behavior, to serve your values, they need to have a reason to do so. The other thing that happens on teams is that change doesn't occur unless we have one important condition called the CAN condition, all right, which is comprised of two different aspects: competence, or a sense of skill and knowledge, and confidence, or self-image. So let's an example. So when we talk about a paraprofessional or a teacher assistant who's assigned to your son or daughter with a visual impairment, they at first may not have the skill or knowledge to be able to effectively serve your son or daughter, all right? And because they don't have the effective knowledge or skills, they may not have or will not have the confidence or self-image, the affect that you need to really affect change and to affect the ability to provide the services that your son or daughter would need. Right? So it's, again, we'll get back to this, but it's important to remember that for anyone to provide appropriate services, they need a sense of competence and confidence, or a CAN condition, the ability to feel that, yes, I can do this. The other golden rule is use your behavior to create perceptions that create the adequate reason to stimulate new behavior. This is not to place all the burden on you as a family, but as, in conjunction with your teacher of the visual impairments, teacher of the deafblind, orientation mobility specialist, you want to help people understand better what the specific and unique needs of your son or daughter are without making them feel or attacking their values, but to make them feel that, yes, this is a doable situation and you can provide appropriate services. What we're talking about here is the fact that we need to create what I call a shared understanding. Again, so that people can understand the unique needs of students with visual impairments. So I have on the slide a picture of two people having a communication or a discussion. And you see the person on the left is trying to get a message to the person on the right. What you see above his head is a bubble which contains all the different things that go into communication. His emotions, his understanding of what he's talking about, the vocabulary he's using. All these things go into the message. And then on the person on the right is attempting to decode or understand that message. And as they're doing that, and you may have had this experience, they may be thinking ahead, oh, I got to say this so I can really address what they're saying and I will still get my point across. And so they end up not listening adequately, and then they send back a communication. I like this picture because what it really does and says is we have to remember how difficult communication can be and how careful and clear we need to be in sending our message and also in responding to the messages of others. You saw in that video that people didn't respond very well to the other person's message. They were aggressive, they were negative, they didn't listen. And I know you've heard this many times, but communication is listening first and then responding. Keep this little graphic in mind when you think about what's going on in a meeting. And then you multiply that meeting by the fact that you have an OT, PT, a speech person who may have a different perspective and understanding of things. They're trying to share with you information from their perspective, and their language or their terminology may be foreign to you as a family. That's when you go back and you ask a question, all right? we need to go into the meeting confident that we can respond, but more often that we can ask questions for clarification. The reason I talk about creating shared understanding is that the lack of understanding of the impacts of visual impairments on access to learning is a major impediment for a comprehensive service delivery. What does this mean? It means that we have to remember that we're part of a microcosm. So in this slide, I have a group of people standing in circles, all right? And if you look at the circle in the very front of the slide, there's a very, very little tiny person there. And this is not to be demeaning or negative, but that's us. That's students with visual impairments. When you think about the scope of services and special education services that have to be provided within a school district, as a low incidence population, students with visual impairments are a very, very small piece of that. On top of that, students with deaf blindness are even a smaller piece of that. Most, I'll use that term, special education directors have limited knowledge, limited experience with the service delivery systems that are necessary for students with visual impairments because they don't deal with it that often. Most PTs, OTs, other service providers are in the same situation. They don't provide those services often, so what happens is that they really don't understand what's needed. So they come at the issue from their perspective, and again, if they can get more confidence and competence in the sense of what the student needs, they are open to listening. I have gone through many, many IEP meetings, more than I can imagine. And I've found that that's very often the case, that first, we need to have people understand the unique needs of students with visual impairments and ways that their service system may be slightly different, may need adjustment to enable them to succeed in schools. If we work from the premise of a low incidence population, one of our first goals is to help people understand what our sons and daughters might see. So, I'm going to hold up an item here. This is a simulator or a goggle which simulates 2400 vision. There are goggles which simulate other types of vision. But your teacher, the visually impaired, or you as a parent even, can bring to a meeting simulators, or you can use iPad apps or video clips of students, your son or daughter or others, to demonstrate what the child with a visual impairment sees. What are the impacts of total blindness? That's easy to do. You use a blindfold and have people experience it. What are the impacts of a field loss, like a central field loss? Again, there are iPad apps which simulate that, or goggles. But the idea is to somehow convey to special education director and members of the team what your child's seeing, because they don't often understand that. So let me give you an example. I had a student who had a vision of 2400 and was transitioning from a early intervention program into a preschool program. She was doing quite well developmentally, was on target in most areas, and had spent time in a preschool program or a early childhood program at her local church. And when the team went to visit her, they said, "Oh, she doesn't seem like she has any visual problems." In this case, she wasn't even wearing glasses, and they were like, "Oh, well, she looks great. She's doing fine." And what happened was that when we were going to get ready for the IEP meeting, they kept saying, "We're not going to put in services for this child at age 3. She doesn't need them. We'll see what happens later on." I felt it was very important, and I do feel it's very important, that when a student transitions from early intervention, which is a home-based service, to school-based services, that we need to be thinking about the fact that it's a different setting, different demands, different activities that they're not used to, and that they need to be able to really, the team needs to really understand what the impacts may be of that visual impairment. So what I did was I set up a time that I would meet with the team in their classroom, and I had the classroom teacher, the special education director did come. the teacher assistants in the room, and I had them wearing goggles that simulated the vision loss. And I had them say, well, where do you sit when you do circle time with the child? And you do reading books. And they said, well, we sit over here. So I said, you sit there, I'll be the teacher, and I'm going to go up front with a book, and I want you to tell me what's happening in the book. And I began to read the book, and I pointed to pictures and said, what do you see here? And they kept saying, we don't see anything right here. And we can't tell what you're really talking about, what we're looking at. And I said, and that's the point why she needs, in this case, the little girl needed some initial services to make sure she's adapting to the tasks in the classroom effectively. We did the same thing with their play areas. I went across the room and I said, what am I playing with? What am I doing? And they really couldn't tell me. And I said, well, that's another reason that, she needs to have facilitation to understand what her friends are doing until she gets used to this classroom. They did put in initial services. She had services for about 6 months, and then those services decreased to an effective but reasonable level based upon her needs. So just an example of using simulators or using ways to help people understand better the true impacts on learning of visual impairment. So to understanding the IEP and its process is the other important part of developing an effective team or having an effective meeting. So it's important to remember that IEP is founded on federal law, and it's a team document that you develop jointly with the district, the educator, and the members of the team. It's not a document that the town develops for you. It should be developed with you. And I like this term. It's an educational roadmap founded on a joint vision and collaborative implementation, all right, with ongoing monitoring of agreed upon goals and objectives. And what this means is that we take, and we'll talk about this in a minute, we establish a vision for the child of where we want to go within the next year and within the next 5 years, so that we can be thinking ahead as to what effective strategies and goals are for that child to achieve. But it should be founded on what I'll call a joint vision. So I'm not going to go into reading all the different laws because it may not be very exciting, but it's important to remember that at the federal and state level, law calls for appropriate academic and functional skill area assessment. I'll explain that in a minute and what that impacts. The evaluation also looks at the student's current academic and functional performance, how the disability affects their participation in the general curriculum, and what types of accommodations or modifications are needed so that the child can participate in appropriate activities. And those appropriate activities are age-appropriate activities. And throughout the child's school career, not just when they move into preschool, their focus should be on maximizing their participation within all aspects of the school program. The key part of that is assessment, and the law requires appropriate assessment. And this is, again, where your teacher of the visually impaired comes in, and their importance as members of the team, and the fact that they should be reaching out to the OT, PT, and other people in the classroom teacher, as to the appropriate types of assessments or the modifications of those assessments which may occur due to the visual impairment and or additional disabilities. So what does that mean? Assessments under the law would include, all right, if you look at the Braille bills that occur within all states, a functional vision and learning media assessment. But I also want to add that for students with cortical visual impairment, utilization of an appropriate CVI assessment tool. And this is important because a child with a cortical visual impairment may have an ocular condition or an eye condition on top of the cortical visual impairment, but that the needs and service outcomes and goals for a student with cortical visual impairment are slightly different than the needs and outcomes of services for a child, say, with albinism, a child with total blindness. The other type of assessment required by law is orientation mobility assessment. And that in the early years may be a collaborative assessment between an O&M professional and the physical therapist and or occupational therapist to look at what the movement needs are for the individual child. The other assessments under the law are assistive technology assessments. And these apply across the board relative to communication, adaptive equipment, things that enable the student to access the curriculum more effectively. And then finally, looking again at academic and functional areas of assessment. And here's where your expanded core curriculum comes in, all right? And again, I know the Massachusetts IEP the best, but I want you to look at your IEPs, and each IEP should have a statement about participation within the general curriculum, which is the academic curriculum, but then they also have, or usually have, or should have, functional areas of assessment. Things like, self-help skills, recreation and leisure, those things that fall under the expanded core curriculum may have slightly different terms, all right? But they are appropriately embedded, or they are embedded in most IEPs across the states. So for example, in Massachusetts, extracurricular activities is part of the decision-making grid on Part B, or Person Levels of Educational Performance B. And if you look at what is extracurricular activities, they can be deemed recreation and leisure. And, where students without disabilities have access to after-school activities or clubs and things like that, we need to look at, can we appropriately incorporate students with visual impairments in those, and thus expand their leisure skills. Self-help skills, again, looking at the fact that to be independent and to function within a classroom, you need to have appropriate self-care skills, and the more your self-care skills are up to par, the easier it is for you to focus on other activities in the classroom. The IEP then is a tool for collaboration, and I'm going to share some concepts from the book Getting to Yes by Yuri and Fisher. It's a really good book, and it's in the resource list because it talks about the fact that many times, and you saw it again in the video, people will come into a meeting with what's called positional advocacy, meaning that I have my position based upon my area of expertise, based upon the fact that I'm a parent, and you need to understand my position. What happens with that is many times then teams become disjointed. Everybody's jockeying for their position. The SPED director says, well, you got to see my position. If I do this for your student, I may end up having to do it for all the students, things like that. And so that's called positional advocacy, meaning we're advocating for our unique and separate positions. What we really want to do is base our advocacy on establishment of common interests, or that there are basic outcomes for an IEP that we need to be thinking about as not positions, but interests. What are the common goals? What are the things that the IEP defines as our projected outcomes? One of the statements I have on the slide here talks about the IEP process becomes most effective when there's open dialogue and communication. And it says, ideally prior to the day of the actual meeting. One of the drawbacks of current IEP development oftentimes is that there is not effective outreach by the different members of the team to the family to really get to understand the family, to get to understand the child, and to get to understand what the goals and visions are. All right, and so what we want to begin to do is to look at how can we base our discussions around this individual child, your son or daughter, not so much on our positions, but on our shared interests, which I'll give you an example of in a minute. So we want to develop an IEP focused on interests, not positions, as I just said. Agreements satisfy underlying interests, and yet most participants focus on positions. We discussed this already, but I can't reinforce that enough. We have to look at what are our goals. We all went into education with common goals. We want to provide an appropriate education for all of the students that we serve. And to do that, again, going back to prior slides, we need that sense of confidence and competence. Our interests define the problems. So what are our goals? We need to share our desires, concerns, and fears. And the IEP as a document, or the use of person-centered planning, is a technique that we can use to really have members of the team talk about issues, concerns. And then the IEP should be structured around the common interests. And I'm going to give 3 terms that I'm going to define: access, participation, and supports. These are what an IEP as a document is structured to provide. And I'll define those terms in a minute. So access. Access is providing a wide range of activities and environments for every child by removing physical barriers and offering multiple ways to promote learning and development. Access is what we want for our students. The reason that they go to school is to access the curriculum, be that the academic curriculum, and to access the functional curriculum. It's also to access different areas of the school. It might be physical education, it might be the art room, it might be the music room, or those activities. And it doesn't matter whether it's a inclusive program or a specialized school, the child in the class needs to have access to all the different aspects of the school environment. Participation, next slide, is using a range of instructional approaches to promote engagement in play and learning activities and a sense of belonging for every student. We overcome participation barriers by access tools, all right? Our instructional approaches. So on the IEP, you have terms like adaptations, modifications, and accommodations, which based upon, in the case of a student with visual impairments, their learning media assessment. We look at their learning style and strengths of the individual, and then we bring in the changes, the modifications, accommodations, which we need to make so that they can access, again, that word cycles back, but not just access, but now actively participate in the life of the school. All right, so not just within the curriculum, but within school activities. What will it take to have them be part of the lunchtime? You know, and it doesn't mean that every student has to be involved in every aspect of the day within a large group. It can be individual times, but it does mean that our goal or common interest is to look ahead to how we can maximize their participation. And the last term is support. Now this support, again, looking at learning media assessment, it determines the supports for the students, but I want to take the term support, and I'll read it for now, but both for the student, but also for the broader aspects of the system, such as the professional development, incentives for inclusion, and opportunities for communication and collaboration among families and professionals to assure high quality instruction. Then we go back to those phrases, the can condition. Again, effective education of your sons and daughters won't occur in an inclusive setting, won't occur in a special class, may not occur in a specialized school, unless those staff members who are working with them understand your child is a unique individual, but also understand the implications of the different disabilities or issues or special needs that your son or daughter may have. So when we talk about support, it's not just a one-to-one paraprofessional, but it goes beyond that, because if we do give a student a one-to-one paraprofessional, but they're not adequately trained or adequately competent, then we're not really doing the service for that child. We've just added a person, right? So professional development, knowledge on the part of the providers is really important. You know, here's another example. So if a person has worked with students with visual impairments and or deafblindness all their life, all right, so they're a trained teacher, they're a trained paraprofessional, and they've worked with students with these conditions, they make adaptations naturally to tasks. So they come upon an art activity and they may take that art activity, they might increase the tactile nature of the art activity, they might increase the contrast, they might use hand under hand to really facilitate the student participation within the activity, and they do it naturally. A person who has not worked with students with visual impairments isn't going to have that natural ability to make adaptations. They need to be trained, and their training needs to be reinforced relative to the types of adaptations that a student with visual impairments may need so that they can access and participate in the curriculum. All right, so these are common interests. If we begin to think about our IEPs as based upon increasing access, participation, and look at the necessary supports that the student needs, they're going to be more successful in school. All right, because again, we're not talking about our individual services and positions, but what we're talking about is our common goal, which is that this student will participate in whatever school program they're in to the best of their ability. So our goal is to develop a shared vision, all right, where your vision and the team vision of the team come together, and we base upon that the creation of a good program. And many times the problem that happens is those vision statements are shared or developed at the meeting, or maybe there's on the IEP, it has a proposed vision statement. And what I'm going to suggest is that we really think ahead, and that our vision should be shared prior to the meeting, because the whole IEP's development is based upon what is the vision that we have for the student with visual impairments, you know, our hopes, dreams, and concerns as families and parents. All right, what do we want for our son or daughter? And what does the school system want? And we bring those visions together to really have a common perspective. All right. And in terms of that common perspective, you know, it's best if it's shared prior to the meeting, because the IEP actually should be developed from the vision statement. And it's important for us all to remember that the goals and objectives, the things that we target for this particular child, should come out of our vision of what we want them to achieve. So the shared vision, the vision statement generally on IEP says, what is the vision for the student? Consider the next 1 to 5 year period. And then we also look at the student's strengths and the key evaluation results. And again, I want to stress that our profiles, our perspectives on students should be strength-based profiles, that we should be looking at what that child can do, what their interests are, and based upon their personal attributes, what our goals and objectives are for them, all right? And again, that strength-based piece is much more important, because from strengths, you can build motivation. From understanding student strengths and abilities, you can build appropriate goals and utilize techniques to foster positive outcomes. And the team, again, should reach consensus on this vision. So the IEP vision is also what focuses our goals and objectives. These strengths and abilities are based upon appropriate assessment again, and again, our shared common interest to provide access, participation, and support are what will enable us to set goals that are both measurable and attainable, so that we can monitor the student's progress. And we need to implement and reinforce these aspects. And I'm going to stress this across not just the student's school day, but including the home. I think one of the things that COVID-19 has done is has fostered greater homeschool participation, because we've been doing more things by Zoom, where teachers may be reaching out to families in their homes. I know infants and toddlers have had telecommuting home visits. And what that's done, and what I've heard from educators, is that it's given them a better perspective on what goes on in the home and home life. They feel it's also helped parents better understand what the goals and objectives are within the classroom and why schools do certain activities. And I feel that that as much as this pandemic has been a negative in our lives, it also has pointed to the fact that the more we can increase homeschool communication, the better the outcomes will be for children with visual impairments. And, you know, I know that the school day, you know, many people say ends at 3 or 2:30, whatever time your child gets out of school. But in reality, their day at home needs to be a continuation, to the best extent possible, of many of the supports and activities of the school. So the things that enable them to access the curriculum at school, I mean, should be able to help them access functional learning at home. And so we need to have a good connections, good communication and good relationships between homes and schools so that information can be shared and the students' progress can be more effective. We're going to look at a second half of that video, or video part 2 on the next slide, which looks at the fact that what goes into a more effective meeting. What are the things that you see that are different in this video compared to the initial video that we saw earlier? Okay, and look at specifically at places where people are talking, listening, and understanding each other more, or trying to understand each other more.
Well, welcome back to our reconvened IEP meeting. I think before we get started, just to make sure everyone knows each other, we should all introduce ourselves. I'm Bruce Goldstein. I'm the Director of Special Education for the school district.
I'm Sue Griebler. I'm the first grade teacher at Jones Elementary School.
I'm Joe Frisetta. I'm Reed's dad and also the designated note taker too.
I'm Gail Frisetta, Reed's mom.
I'm Virginia Stern. I'm the speech language pathologist at the Kennedy School.
And here I've brought a picture of Reed. I don't think any of you have met him yet.
He's
Cute.
yeah,
Very
he's
nice.
adorable. Very nice.
Thank you.
Well, we're here to pick up on the issues that we hadn't resolved at the last meeting. Talk about program and talk about services. Now, did you get an opportunity to go to the Kennedy School?
Actually, we didn't get a chance to. We had an appointment with Mrs. Stern last week, and Reed got sick, and we were unable to make that appointment. But I did have some questions about the Kennedy School, if you don't mind. I'd like to ask some of these questions. Mrs. Stern, at the Kennedy School, how many children are in each of the classrooms?
Well, altogether we have 55 students with communication disorders, all kinds of communication disorders, and of course they're different ages. So they spend half the day in the regular classroom and half the day in a communication-focused classroom, and there are between 5 and 8 students in those classes.
Okay. And is there individual speech therapy provided for those children?
Yes. All the children, they receive therapy 1 or 2 times a week, twice a week usually.
Just to interject, some of those are group sessions and some are individual sessions.
Okay. And how do you work on socialization skills between the deaf and hard of hearing children and the other children in the classrooms there?
Well, since so many of the deaf and hard of hearing children have implants now, we believe that they are getting the kind of socialization language, both in listening and speaking, that is important. And so they are getting it in a natural way.
I've heard some really good things about your program. Thank you for sharing that with us.
We're very proud of our program at Kennedy. We've tried to do a school where we've really got people who have background and experience in working with deaf and hard of hearing children, so we can really provide a natural environment, but with people who have that experience. Because at the alternative at the Jones School, what's your experience? Have you had deaf
I
children?
have not had a deaf child in the class. I've had a few hard of hearing students, and some of them did quite well.
Okay. So you haven't had any deaf children in your classroom. Are you willing to work with a deaf child in your classroom?
Oh, I would be willing to. I think I would need some cues from you to make that an easier transition for him.
Okay.
We've heard you've done fantastic things with the children you've had.
Well, thank you.
Well, I wanted to provide some information for you also. I have a report here from Reed's Auditory Preschool. I have a copy here for you, for each of you. This report talks about the need for Reed to have speech therapy 3 times a week, at a minimum 3 to 5 times a week for 30-minute sessions. And they really feel that that's an important stepping stone for him to close his language gap. And I also have another letter here from his audiologist that supports the need for intensive speech therapy for you.
All right, well, we appreciate your providing this to us. We're going to obviously have to digest this. Mrs. Stern, am I correct that typically we've looked at 2 sessions a week for children?
Yes, that's what we provide, and actually at Kennedy School, because we do have the 55 children with special needs, we can arrange the therapy sessions more efficiently.
Well, we're really looking at Reed having 3 therapy sessions with a speech and language pathologist who is experienced with working with deaf and hard of hearing children. And what I hear you saying, is this correct, that you usually at Kennedy provide those services just twice a week?
If indicated,
Okay,
yes.
just twice a week.
Right, well, what we can do, and I don't want to keep on prolonging meetings, but one of the things we could do is take a look at this and you have a chance to review it.
Right.
And then we can at least come back on this and talk about whether we're talking 2 sessions or 3 sessions, and look at that. We might also look at the possibility of going with one or the other and coming back and reconvening in a shorter period of time. Now, we don't want to delay for services, so maybe we could agree that we'll start with the 2, because that's what, but we'll come back after we've reviewed this and see if we feel it should go up, come back in a month maybe and see how the progress has been.
The 3 could be a possibility then?
Yeah, it could be a possibility. Definitely, we would have to provide an appropriate education for Reed, and if that's what he needs, then that's what we would surely be obligated and willing to do.
Okay, well, that's something we could really consider, twice a week. The other issue that we were looking at for Reed was his socialization skills. I did have the opportunity to look at the procedural safeguards provided by the school district at our first IEP meeting, and as I understand it, the safeguards do talk about education in a regular classroom for disabled children with supplemental aids. This would really provide Reed, if we were able to place him in the Jones School, with the opportunity to build friendships with children in his neighborhood.
One concern I'd have about an individual aid is if we're talking socialization, that aid could kind of come between Reed's interactions with his hearing peers, and with an adult in the middle, that wouldn't be a naturalized situation. It might actually impede some of that interaction.
If you had an aide in the classroom, wouldn't that be a benefit for other children of special needs? Couldn't you incorporate more children into that room?
This is the way the aid is usually used in the classroom. It gives the teacher more time to spend with the special children who need her help, and then there's someone else to direct some of the other activities.
Well, so now that's more in line with now we're talking a classroom aid as opposed to an individual aid. Something we could consider. What we're also concerned about, though, is Reed has this language delay. Mrs. Stern, about how much of a gap is that?
I believe 12 to 18, 16 to 18 months, yeah.
All right, so in the 12 to, let's say, 18-month range, we're concerned that if Reed goes into a regular classroom, if he were at Jones, we really don't have experience in working with deaf children there. So at Kennedy, the regular education teachers have, in fact, worked with children who are deaf. And we could make sure that whatever teacher Reed would have at Kennedy for the first half of the day in the regular classroom would be a teacher who has had deaf children before. And then work intensively during the afternoon in the special class to try to deal with this language gap, as opposed to putting him into the classroom and having an aide who we don't want to come in between his interaction, but we want to try to bring his language up to speed. So
Well, I'd be happy to provide some contacts, or even work with you myself, Mrs. Griebler, in the classroom to give you some ideas on working with Reed in the classroom, and put you in contact with the people who have worked with him at his oral school. I think that it would be a really great time for him to move. He's right now moving from his oral school where he is with other deaf children, and it's a great transition time for him to move right into the neighborhood school, as opposed to maybe going to Kennedy right now and moving back to Jones in a year or so. I think it's an opportune time for Reed to make a move to his neighborhood school with the support of an aide in the classroom that could, as my husband said, be there to also support other children with disabilities.
And I think that's an opportunity, maybe further down the road, for me to be trained and get some help from you and from other people in the field so that I could work with him in the classroom.
Absolutely.
Well, I think what I'm hearing here is that, well, we've got several competing interests, which is always the situation. We
Sure.
run into that all the time, and trying to figure out what would be the right type of situation. Balancing what are the positives and negatives of placement at the Jones School versus the positives and negatives at the Kennedy School. And I hear you saying, I think, that going to Jones School would be one less transition, and having to bring in some background and information to assist a teacher such as Mrs. Griebler, if that's in fact where Reed were placed. On the other side, a program already in place at the Kennedy School where there's been this experience in working with deaf children, and having him out of the regular classroom a little bit more, but getting more intensity of service with somebody who's got that background. So we're going to have to discuss this a little bit more to see if it could work. It so happens that at the Jones School, we don't have a speech-language pathologist that has background and experience in working with deaf children. At the Kennedy School, because we've set that up for deaf children, Mrs. Stern is the one who has that background. So that could be a problem.
Yeah, you're right. That is the other issue, is the speech and language for Reed. As an alternative, what if we offered to provide the transportation and take Reed, if we had Reed placed at Jones School, take Reed over to Kennedy for his speech language twice a week, if you're
Great idea.
recommending that.
Well, that is something I guess we could consider. We'd have to look at the scheduling and see how, when the schools, start and stop, and the transportation time, and see if that could be worked out. But let us look into that. I don't want to prolong, obviously, having more meetings, but it's important to us to make sure that Reed does get an appropriate education. So why don't I check into that, and you can check with the principal over at Jones, and maybe you can get some more information from Kennedy, and I'll gather that together, and then we can come back and talk a little bit further about that. Does that sound agreeable to you?
Thank you, Mr. Goldstein. We really do appreciate you working with us.
So what did you see in that video? All right. You saw people that related to each other in a more positive way. They were introductions, so that people went around the room so they could really understand who's who and what they did. The parent brought a picture of their son, and I highly recommend the use of pictures, use of videos in our program at the consortium, or the collaborative program. We had students come to meetings and show, using their switches, a little video of what they do at school, so that the special education director or the school district representatives better understood them. The parents better understood what was happening at school. And it focuses the discussion on the student. The child with visual impairments is the reason that we're there. And that, by having that picture in the room, or by having the student themselves come for part of the meeting so people can really get to meet them and see who they are, we are creating, again, another common interest, that we're developing a shared vision around a real person. We're not developing a shared vision around a student or someone we don't know, and we're not developing a shared vision around a piece of paper, which can sometimes happen with an IEP. You'll see that although in this video the parents didn't go to visit the school, they had a reason why. And then they began to ask questions. There was a dialogue between the parents and the school about what their different programs were like. People were honest and open, and their body language was more positive and more attentive. So those are things that what we'll call golden bricks, all right? They build connections. They create the ability for us to develop an IEP which is based upon goals and outcomes and not positions. The heart of collaborative advocacy, the concept which I'm trying to share, and to help us avoid those situations where we go into meetings with negative mindsets or we go in feeling defensive, is to establish a successful relationship. And relationships are based on, as you see here on this slide, teamwork, trust, inspiration, exchange, assist, support, success, sharing, all right? I'm going to briefly describe each of those terms. Mutual respect and trust. We need to regard all members of the team as colleagues. We're not adversaries, you know, and again, I mentioned we may have heard certain things about members of the team. Go into team meetings with an open mind. I'm not saying be naive, but go in with the belief that if we understand one another and people really understand the issues that our son and daughter need addressed so they can be effective in school, then we'll go in with this sense of trust that this is everyone wants a similar outcome. Exchange, develop a dialogue, all right? Be open to diverse viewpoints. This is important. Many of the changes, and I'll give you an example, that occurred in my program when I was running the preschool occurred because families raised the question. I had one little girl who was not ready to go into a graded setting, but the parent believed that she should be in an integrated program and said, you know, like, let's have her come to your specialized preschool with the belief that she's going to move on at age 5 to kindergarten. Well, she didn't move on to kindergarten at age 5, she moved on at age 6. And then she ended up going through the public school system for her whole life. And now she's a translator in Spanish language. We never would have attempted that experiment, if you want to call it that, or that program option, except that the parent raised it, the parent believed in it, but the parent also worked with us and understood our viewpoints and perspectives on what the student would need to achieve. We had a good positive dialogue. Again, we've talked about supports for students, staff, and families to ensure that sense of competence and confidence that's needed to provide quality services. We need to be committed to those supports. You know, it's not just the teacher or the visually impaired coming in once a week and having a direct service session and then maybe a consult session, but are there ways that that teacher or the visually impaired can overlap over time with different service providers like PT, OT, to assure that they understand the visual impairments and their impacts, and then to support them with appropriate training. Share a vision, share your hopes and aspirations for student success. All right, this is at the core of the IEP. We want to develop a belief system of where we want to go and where the child will go in the future. All right, and begin each year with revisiting our vision and saying, okay, what are the next steps? Teamwork. Student success is founded on interdependence. Our students, sons and daughters, have multiple service providers, as we saw earlier, and those multiple service providers need to work together, all right? You know, there's that whole discussion in education of pull out or push in services. Services need to be a combination, you know, for students dependent upon their individual needs, skills, and abilities, all right, and their individual strengths. And then we need to work cooperatively. You know, again, progress in the use of assistive technology, say for communication, is not going to be effective if the tool is only used in 1 or 2 sessions a day. It needs to follow the student throughout their school day and into the home environment so they really can form the understanding that this is their tool to connect with the world. Inspiration. Acceptance of new thoughts. And again, that example I gave you from that other family, or from that family, you know, challenged us as individuals and service providers to think differently. And it led to really positive outcomes and changes in our program relative to services for preschoolers. Developmental, again, things happen in incremental steps, you know. And that is not just the development of the student, all right, but it also is relative to teams, and the forming of an interdependent connection. All right, so collaboration is a winding road, all right? It doesn't go in a smooth, a straight line. And again, this is the reason it's not just the role of the teacher, of the family, not just the role of the teacher, not just the role of the administrator, although the administrator should play a key role in keeping the team collaborative. But it's going to go up and down. Your child changes grade levels. They go from first grade to second grade. Your child changes teachers. They change PT, they change OT, they change speech and language providers, all right? Or they're paraprofessional, the teacher assistant all of a sudden leaves, okay? Well, all those things happen, and we all know that happened. But if you have a good functioning and strong team, what that team does will embrace the new person, bring them in, and bring them up to speed, enable them to understand the specific needs of your son or daughter, their strengths, their interests, and provide effective services. One way to think about this in summary is to think about these key concepts so that student success, the success of your son and daughter, no matter what school setting, requires a home-school partnership. The better the communication between home and school, the more effective the student's development will be. A concrete example of this, I was asked recently to discuss a situation of a particular child, and I went up and did an observation, and the program actually was functioning very well, and the child was making progress, but there was a lot of miscommunication between the family and the school. And it ended up that things resolved in a very positive way when they began to communicate more effectively. Again, stress on it's a developmental, incremental process. And collaboration involves, and again, using a graphic, which I feel sort of hopefully captures it for you and can sort of stick in your head, is that it involves our heads, all right, our ability to come together, share our ideas, share our vision, and create common goals and objectives. It involves our hearts, all right, belief in the ability of the child to grow and achieve, and it involves our hands, our ability to work together to support one another in an independent program. So thank you for your attention. The last few slides in the presentation are a series of resources that you may be able to use.